You clicked to find out how a routine Minneapolis audit could end with a midnight federal rescue at sea. You're in the right place. We're tracing the exact path from duplicated insurance and Medicaid records to a command center lit by red maps at 3:28 a.m. when boarding teams moved with one rule. No threat reaches the children. Stay with me as we reveal the shell companies, the offshore corridors, and the encrypted messages that turned $2.9 billion in public funds into a global trafficking engine. And why 236 missing American kids became the priority of a multi-agency, multi-service response. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Why would one duplicated policy in Minneapolis trigger a months-long forensic review? Because the math didn't add up, and the metadata wouldn't let it slide. In a back room built for routine audits, two entries sat side by side. Same beneficiary details, same coverage codes. Yet the internal ledger and the state database disagreed on who owed what. A junior analyst flagged it for reconciliation. The team expected a typo. Instead, the audit tool surfaced a second pair, then a third, with the same odd signature, mirrored fields where human error tends to drift. They drilled into the logs, timestamps clustered within tight windows, the IP addresses repeated. Device fingerprints, those small identifiers left by workstations and remote terminals, recurred across files that had no business touching each other. Different claim numbers, different providers, different counties. The pattern looked mechanical, not messy. When they extended the look back to 90 days, the export returned 8,200 entries that shared the same DNA. Duplicated beneficiaries, recycled addresses, and payout routes that kept showing up under fresh policy IDs. The fraud model emerged from volume. IDs were reassigned in waves. Beneficiaries appeared twice under slight variations. Middle initials swapped, birth dates nudged by a day. Payments didn't hit in lumps. They broke into staggered micro payouts, spaced to slip past batch filters. The money moved small and often, always below the thresholds that trigger automated holds. A clerk could miss it. Algorithms tuned to single claim anomalies would too. Forensic accountants followed the flow. Funds bounced between 3 domestic banks in a tight loop that laundered origin and destination, then settled into vendor accounts tied to names that rented no offices, answered no phones, and filed only the minimum paperwork required to stay active. The first shell name popped on a mail drop tucked inside a shipping store. Its formation agent had incorporated dozens of entities across 4 states with identical boilerplate language and the same registered agent on record. The trail pointed to a logistics brokerage listed as a service vendor. Invoices cited consulting and intake support. The descriptions were vague, but the attachments weren't. Shipping documents carried weights and routes that didn't match any declared service. Reference numbers seen in the claim system appeared as invoice codes. When auditors graphed the payments against those invoices, the lines closed on themselves. Money left public reimbursements, ricocheted through shells, then reappeared offshore without paying for anything measurable. They mapped 23 shells, all linked by formation dates, nominee officers, and shared agents, routing cash in a closed loop that converted reimbursements into liquidity, not healthcare. One more oddity sat in the stack. The logistics invoices lined up with movement schedules, departures and transfers plotted week by week. Those schedules weren't random. Their timing will define what happens next. How do numbers in a spreadsheet become people on a manifest? You line up the time. The invoices looked dull until analysts overlaid payout timestamps from the audit with freight bookings, short-term warehouse rentals, and maritime schedules that had no reason to sit next to healthcare reimbursements. The grid snapped into rhythm. A payout cluster appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. A warehouse rental opened at 1800 hours the same day. A coastal carrier booked overnight lift inside a Gulf Coast departure window 2 days later. The money and the movement kept stepping in sequence. Commodity codes said plastics, furniture, and auto parts. The weights said otherwise. Manifests logged lighter loads than the declared categories, then jumped carriers mid-route without an operational reason. Routes veered through secondary ports, often after dark, with repeat patterns fixed around the same 3 embarkation windows along the Gulf. Insurance certificates followed the freight but attached to entities with no procurement history in those commodities. Each mismatch added another tick on the board. The architecture behind it stood on 23 shells built for endurance. Filings hid in bursts across 4 states, sharing identical registered agents and boilerplate language. Nominee directors rotated in 6-month cycles. Payment streaks originating in 3 foreign jurisdictions converged in those shells, then fanned out to overseas trading firms, commodity brokerages, and generic logistics agencies. Intermediary banks inside Chinese commercial networks chopped wires into micropayments that resurfaced at cash transfer hubs tied to offshore business trusts. The loop hid source and purpose while staying liquid. Follow the flow, and you watch reimbursements turn into tradable assets. The funds moved through front-end trading desks, then re-emerged as retainer fees for maritime brokers and stipends for private security contractors hired as consultants. That link grew teeth when an encrypted device came off an executive's desk. The phone held 42,000 hidden messages, shipping manifests, personnel rosters, offshore account instructions, written in bland language that described growth corridors, asset migration cycles, and external consolidation partners. Analysts decoded those terms as logistics contractors, overseas couriers, and illicit service brokers. Metadata closed the gap. Message timestamps matched wire times. Label codes inside the chats echoed invoice reference strings from the audit. When a wire hit at 9:13 UTC, a booking confirmation stamped the same minute. A freight insurance policy issued on a Friday overlapped with entries in social service databases that logged missing child relocations the following week. Payroll lines funded 92 armed contractors assigned to a specific hole identified in those messages. The device was more than chatter. It was a playbook, routes, roles, and payments, mapped against ledgers and schedules. With the paths fixed and the personnel named, the spreadsheets gave way to an operational plan that moved fast. What turns a fraud case into a national security operation? A clock. The vessel identified in the logistics data had already cleared coastal waters, and the route matched the invoice-driven schedule. At 3 a.m., a unified federal order moved the case from ledgers to a live interdiction. Planners stacked a joint timeline. UAV orbits set to hand off coverage without gaps, naval assets sliding into a silent perimeter, and boarding teams drilling on compartment maps pulled from those same invoices and encrypted messages. Every rehearsal focused on one target set. Holds and corridors marked as likely child locations, with alternative routes in case bulkheads were sealed. Maritime conditions forced adjustments. Crosswinds stacked spray over the bow. Escorts drifted 10 cables off their previous positions, changing approach vectors. Intelligence warned that armed resistance would come from private contractors on payroll lines linked to the shell loop. That pushed armor choices, breaching loads, and the roster for medical stabilization teams set to follow the first wave. The command center ran hot but controlled. Interagency liaisons from federal law enforcement, homeland units, maritime security, and child protection agencies cycling through classified briefings. The single boarding rule stood at the top of every slate. No threat reaches the children. The layered posture tightened over hours. 3 submarines tracked ahead and astern for overwatch. Destroyer-class screens stood wide to cut off any dash toward open water. 12 long-range UAVs fed real-time video to red-lit planning stations, where analysts matched every camera sweep against the compartment maps. When the minute hit, comms jamming cut across hostile channels, and boarding teams hit breach points chosen to isolate the flagged spaces. Lower cargo access points took the first pressure, sealing stairwells and ladders before alert signals could spread. Contact ran fast. Teams neutralized hostile elements in the control spaces and engine areas, then flowed into interior corridors. Room by room, they cleared, secured, and moved. The holds listed in the manifests paid off. Miners sat clustered where the device messages said they would be. Federal personnel clipped open locks, stabilized temperatures, and moved the children in controlled strings toward extraction points. 20 minutes in, the deck changed hands and the ship went under federal control, but the work had only shifted. Immediate triage started on the pier of steel. Medics staged hydration, warming packs, and baseline exams. On the support ships, welfare specialists began intake while analysts cross-checked identities against missing child databases. Many had no documents. Ages ran young. Care teams kept voices low and steps predictable. The schedule built from invoices had become the boarding timeline. Finance turned into a rescue clock that hit every mark. With lives secured, the map flipped back to the network. Seizures in motion, account freezes queued, and the legal wall moving closer. Where does a network that size break first? At the bank, in court, or inside the data that built it? The first hits land where the money still moves. Within 48 hours of the interdiction, emergency freezes locked active accounts and seizure teams tagged balances connected to the shell loop. International partners pushed cooperation notices that widened the ring. So wires stalled mid-route and correspondent banks quarantined transfers before they could launder through trading desks. Investigators moved on property too. Escrowed assets, brokerage positions, and vendor retainers. So liquidity couldn't regroup under a fresh name. The quick freeze didn't remove the friction. State benefit systems that once labeled anomalies as administrative errors faced reversals. Agencies reopened old files and pulled archived reimbursements that had been reassigned to clear backlogs. Some of that evidence shifted under protective classification, which meant local auditors who started the hunt no longer saw key records. Briefings tightened. Case notes moved from shared portals to controlled rooms with sign-in logs and time-limited access. Prosecutors consolidated the fraud counts and filed emergency seizure warrants backed by protective orders. Hearings went under seal. Benefit cases marked as administrative reassignments came back to life. This time with subpoena power over vendors, formation agents, and intermediary bankers. The classified stamp changed court rhythm. Transcripts thinned, annexes disappeared from public dockets, and deadlines aligned with interagency security reviews rather than standard civil calendars. Policy teams absorbed the blow. Identity duplication wasn't a clerical nuisance. It was a system-level vulnerability. Records showed how small edits, middle initials, transposed digits, stale addresses, could pass eligibility filters and spawn new payouts. The reform map took shape fast. Biometric-backed identity checks where statutes allowed, stronger tokenization for beneficiary files, and audit triggers that fire when replication patterns echo across counties or providers. Data sharing agreements kicked in so state, federal, and overseas partners could correlate anomalies without exposing personal details.